Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, and that is the total market value of all goods and services produced in a given year. And it is a monetary measure that is used to compare the relative values of a vast number of goods and services sold in varying years. So an important thing to keep in mind when calculating GDP is to avoid multiple counting. So since many products go through multiple stages of production, some components may be bought and sold many times. So GDP only includes final goods. Only final goods. So let me give you an example. So let's say a sheep ranch sells a certain amount of wool to a wool processor for $120. Who then sells it to a manufacturer for $180, who then sells it to the wholesaler, kind of running out of room there, who then sells it to a retailer for $350. So the price of $350 is going to include all the intermediate transactions that we just talked about, leading up to the final sale of the suit for $350. So the production and sale of the final suit generated $350 worth of output. That would be included in the calculation of GDP. So that way you kind of avoid multiple counting, and you don't include these kind of individual transactions from the sheep ranch to the wool processor to the manufacturer to the wholesaler, and you can get a more accurate measure of GDP. So now that we know that there are many different kinds of monetary transactions that take place in the calculation of GDP, we also need to know there are some transactions called non-production transactions, which have nothing to do with the generation of final goods. So some of these examples are some public transfer payments, and that's going to be stuff like Social Security, welfare, and veterans payments. Another type that is a non-production transaction is private transfer payments. So this is like Christmas time when your grandma gives you money, and so it's not really official, it's just kind of like a private transaction among individuals. So do a little star on top of the tree there. Another type of non-production transaction is a stock market transaction. So that is going to be the trading of stocks and bonds. So that is not calculated in GDP. And then secondly, you're going to have lastly, you're going to have secondhand sales, which means if you have a car that you've had for a while and you sell it to your friend, that is called a secondhand sale, and that is not calculated in GDP. Okay, so there are two different ways that you can look at GDP, and that is expenditure versus income. So here I have drawn up just kind of a simplistic economy in which the household owns all factors of products. And over here, firms and businesses produce all goods and services. So really, really simplistic. So in this example, the households are responsible for all of the expenditures and the revenue for the firms. And then, so the firms are left over with their expenses and their profits, which then in turn just become income for the households, which then becomes the expenditures and the revenue for the firms, and it just kind of goes around in a nice little cycle, kind of like the circular flow model that we talked about earlier. So what income versus expenditures is saying is basically that to measure GDP, you could measure it here, you could measure it here. It doesn't matter because they're all going to be the same. So you could measure it at this point, expenditures, income. It wouldn't really matter because it's all just kind of going to cycle around and be the same. So that is what income versus expenditure view of GDP means.